So the person you see here, if you followed this whole series of lectures you've seen before, last year that was, Sämi Ludwig, my friend from the Université de Haute-Alsace in Mulhouse, who's actually Swiss, and this being a very international thing, this whole UCOR cooperation, we shouldn't be surprised to have Swiss people teaching in France and German people teaching in Switzerland and so on. And we are growing more and more together. And if this increasing togetherness is creditable to one person in particular, it's definitely Sämi Ludwig, to whom I'm also especially grateful that he's on the list of speakers for this series of lectures, this Ringvorlesung, Ringvorlesung, twice this semester. None other, say for myself, has contributed so much to this lecture series. And I'll probably, if I ask anybody in the field who's going to host the next Ringvorlesung this coming winter semester, chances are this will end up with Sämi too. And I promise I will do at least 2 of those lectures, whatever the topic's going to be, Sämi.
I think it's an absolutely fascinating project, and it's an easy and meaningful way to share things. And I wholeheartedly support that we continue this project in some form. And we're financially pretty independent, which is also nice.
News from the University of Freiburg, there is project money to be had at the moment for UCOR cooperations to add to the structures that we already have. And one suggestion that Gerd and I worked out is that we try to establish and manifest somewhere virtually on the programs, on the websites, a common schedule of lectures, a common curriculum where all of the universities can feed in lectures and seminars and so on that students can participate in, either physically in 3D once that becomes possible again, or virtually classes that are either completely or partly taught online, so that we all know well in advance which classes are being offered and by whom, and how people can participate there. And I don't even want to think about the administrative hassle that it will be to then credit all that to everybody in their respective courses. But fortunately, we have somebody like Sissi Breuer who claims that she actually loves administrative work, and she will be able to do that. I'm pretty sure. For the moment, we are just responsible for the project here. And Sämi, it's really great to see you again. Women writers in the Gilded Age. I suggested a title that had more to do with Nathaniel Hawthorne's dictum about the damned tribe of scribbling women that he was so enamored with in the first half of the 19th century. If anything, that tribe of scribbling women increased in size towards the second half of the 19th century. And many of the writers for the budding magazine market in the second half of the 19th century were women, and many of them wrote pretty much run-of-the-mill stuff, but it paid the bills for them, and it went down well with the reading audience, even though it wasn't necessarily literary realism. It certainly wasn't naturalism, and the few that breached into that project and into that field are usually subsumized under the heading of local color. And we know some of their names: Mary Wilkins Freeman, Sarah Orne Jewett, and of course, the author of the Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman, Charles Perkins Gilman. But we'll hear more about them and possibly others now from Sämi Ludwig. Sämi, the floor is all yours. You're the only one visible anyway, so I'll withdraw, sit down next to my wife, and we'll listen to you.
Okay, I'll stay visible. As I just said, thank you very much, Wolfgang, for organizing and setting up all of this. This is extremely fascinating. This is wonderful. Okay. I have done lectures on the 19th century before, and one part of it was about women. And so I'm basically using a lot of this material. My problem tonight is only that I have about 100 plus 120 slides, and I'm not going to be able to show all of this, to talk about all of this to you. And so I will probably have to scroll through some of these contributions. But basically, I'm just going to do some name dropping. I'm going to talk about some authors, and I'm going to give you summaries, samples of their writing. I'm going to point out some texts that I consider extremely interesting and extremely good. And I hope to motivate you to have a look at the original texts, which are, in my opinion, sometimes outstanding. And that's what I'm going to try to show you tonight. Now, there are lots of new voices in the age of Stephen Crane, obviously. And as you found out last time, I'm a bit of a William Dean Howells person. So I will give him a lot of credit for that, because he was, after the Fields family, he was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, which became this very important magazine about literature in the United States. And it was so big because he made it big, and it was very cosmopolitan, and it introduced all kinds of new ideas in America. Howells was a cosmopolitan person. He was multilingual. He had lived in Italy, and this was fairly different to the fireside type of poets, who were, dyed in the wool Americans. So this is also different from the American Renaissance. The Renaissance was mainly a male affair, about New England, about Puritans, about whaling, about sublime nature with the Transcendentalists. But basically, it in many ways, it left out the voices of women. Now, Howells opened up the canon of American literature for minorities. And this is very important. New ethnic groups started writing. They even got published by the Atlantic Monthly. Jewish people, Black people, Native Americans, Asian people, and of course, women. Women were very, very important. As Wolfgang already said, there was a big female readership. A lot of the readers were women. And so finally, women started writing texts, also for women. They started the magazine market, they got published. And of course, because they're women, we find out they started writing about different type of stuff. And I think this is interesting. They were actually so successful that, as Wolfgang said, Nathaniel Hawthorne was even talking about the damn scribbling women. He was very unhappy about this writing competition that he got from the women. He didn't think that was very cool. So anyway, the first name I want to mention is Rebecca Harding Davis, who had friends at the Atlantic Monthly. The J.T. Fields, who was the legendary editor who came before Hawthorne, and his wife Annie Fields, who had lots of literary friendships, contacts, and she was one of them. And so she got published in the Atlantic Monthly. I'm not going to talk to you about her other novel, which I haven't read, unfortunately, but it's supposed to be Realist. I'm going to talk about life in the iron mills. This was published in the Atlantic Monthly, and as you can see, it was published, actually, I think that was even before Crane was born. But, this is basically when you know, if you say post-Civil War, you make a mistake because that's in the middle of the Civil War. But basically, you know, this is the second half of the 19th century type of writing where women become important. And Life in the Iron Mills certainly is very interesting because it's realistic in the sense that it is criticizing industrialization. Okay, the narrator is very important. He starts with a broken angel figure and a dirty cannery. As you know, canneries are the birds that are usually underground, used in mining in order to check if the quality of the air is okay. This is interesting. This is actually something that we're doing nowadays too, because of COVID. You know, we look at the oxygen in the air and we have these fancy devices at the university now. That was an issue in those days when you were, you know, dealing with, you know, digging coal underground. Anyway, we have a Negro-like river of people. The dumb appeal upon the face of the Negro-like river slavishly bearing its burden day after day. This is almost a Stephen Crane type of sentence, but it's full of empathy. It's basically a woman's perspective. It's the typical female thing that you look at somebody suffering and that you're aware of that and you point it out. You say it's important. So she's describing these masses of men, but of course, this is before Stephen Crane. This is a different approach to this mass. So she says, I'm going to take the reader along, and she wants to study the psychology of these people. This is the first page of Life in the Iron Mills, a facsimile of the original printing in the Atlantic Monthly. I just wanted to show this to you because I think it shows you a specific type of literature, you know, small letters, small print, 2 columns. The lines are very close to each other. Please remember, paper was expensive in those days, and so we see here what this type of literature looks like. I think that's important for us to realize. So anyway, Life in the Iron Mills is the story of a man called Hugh Wolfe and his crippled cousin called Deborah. They live low lives of labor, sleeping, eating, drinking, and that's it. And she asks the narrator, is that all of their lives? You know, are they people who are alive sort of condemned to live in hell because the iron mill is compared to a city of fire? And so basically the narrator leads the reader into this hell. If you go into this mill, so industrial work, the mill, I hope you realize, is in a religious sense compared to the place of the devil, to hell. And the problem is not only that people are punished or suffering, but that they are starved. You know, they're like zombies. It's a state of living death, and their soul is starving. This also explains the name Wolf, because Wolf is the guy who is hungry. He's hungry for life, for spiritual satisfaction. He has a fierce thirst for beauty. He wants to be creative. And so basically the question is, what is going to happen to such a person who has this strength but is a lowly worker? You know, he's going to get in trouble. So there is a story then happening when the mill owner shows guests, and they're basically looking at the working place at the mill, and you have several people. There's a big difference between the workers and the well-to-do visitors. Very important. And somehow the reality between them is separated. You know, there's a gulf between them, and somehow the other people are like spectral figures. This is almost like Plato's cave. It's almost like a different type of reality. So anyway, when the guests come in, they find a statue of a white woman, which is very beautiful, and it's made out of coral. Coral is a kind of side product that is created when you create iron, okay? And this man is carving this statue. Wolf is an artist. He can carve beauty out of, you know, kind of a leftover product from the industrial production. You know, coral is a refuse from the ore after the pig metal is run, we read. And this man is able to, you know, in the place of that is ugly as hell, you know, to create beauty out of this. So the men are impressed by this, but somehow nobody is helping him, you know. They don't understand how to interpret the statue. They don't feel responsible. They don't want to help him. And when they talk about philanthropy, one of these characters says, a man may make himself as he chooses. And I hope you see that this is the standard phrase of American individualism. And when the puddler, when Wolf, the poor man, says, will you help me? One of these visitors called Mitchell says, why should one be raised when myriads are left? So basically, we should not help one specific individual to succeed if so many of them will be left behind. I hope you realize this is a typical illustration of social Darwinism. So this is interesting. We can discuss all of these ideologies when we read this text. So anyway, you have these visitors, they leave, and Hugh Wolf is left behind. He realizes how humiliated he is, how low, that nobody is going to help him. What am I worth, Deb, is what he asks his cousin. And then what happens is that Deborah finds a small roll of money. This means that when the guests were visiting, one of the guests lost his wallet. It dropped to the floor and she found it. So the story then continues on a Sunday morning, of course, when everybody is preaching Christianity. And this is then also when Dr. May is reading the newspaper about the trial against you. And we found out that he was arrested, and the people said that he had stolen the money. And so he was punished with 19 years of penitentiary. And Dr. May says, on Sunday, serves him right, after all our kindness that night. Okay. So I hope you realize that these working class people are fighting against a system of justice that is set against them. The story then continues in the jail. There's a man called Haley who is the jailer, and we find out that Wolf does not want to have a lawyer who defends him and claims that the money is his own. That's interesting. That's almost a Marxist point of view. Anyway, but he wants to escape, and he's is trying to escape twice, 3 days after he tried it again. And we read that he fought like a tiger. Now, I hope you realize the 3 days remind us a little bit of Jesus Christ and the image of the tiger. Christ, the tiger is also something that we've seen before in T.S. Eliot and also in some other texts. I'm not a specialist about this, I have to say. Anyway, what happens then is that Deborah finds out that Wolf is going to commit suicide when she visits him. She knows that he no longer wants to live. She's in a sense like the woman who is not the big artist, but she has the sensibility of finding out what's happening, how people are feeling. And there's this scene where basically he's inside the jail. There's a market outside. And again, this is like a picture. So it's like reality and representation. This is the same motif that we had with Plato's cave, that basically the reality for him is not real, but it's only a representation. And this wonderful line where he even envies the dog who is walking after his master. Anyway, what happens then is that Deborah sleeps in a cell next to him. She hears the dull bit of tin where he is cutting his veins, and he commits suicide. The narrator says his dumb soul was alone with God in judgment. Notice that this is the typical New England religious attitude, where ultimately the judgment is the judgment of God and not the judgment of secular law. This is the kind of attitude that is extremely common before the Civil War with the abolitionists, you know, who said, I don't believe in the secular law. I believe in a higher law that tells me that slavery is illegal, even though it was legal at that time. So anyway, you have more references to Jesus Christ. Father, forgive them, you know, the people who basically sacrifice him. So Wolf becomes like a Jesus figure. He's a martyr. And on the next day, Deborah is holding the dead body in her arms, a little bit like an aggressive pietà. Notice the extremely powerful theological Bible imagery that we have in this text. And then the person who comes in is probably the narrator. It's a Quaker woman who opens the window and she asks, Deborah asks, did her know you? And she says, I know you now. You rhymes with you. There's a kind of empathy. This is really interesting writing, I want to say, okay? And you see here again the call for empathy. You're supposed to try to understand these other people, and it asserts that you can know these other people. She heard about you, she learned about you, the narrator, and now she knows him, and they bury him. Okay, and so at the end, basically, the statue points east because that is still left, in a sense, as a token of his life. And we have to remember his fate. So the life in the iron mills ends with the last description, then again, of a city of fires. And just look at some of these words: pits of flame, cauldrons, and you have these half-clad men, you know, the iron workers, who look like revengeful ghosts in the red light. Ultimately, it was like a street in hell. Anyway, I wanted to quickly present you this story, Life in the Iron Mills, because it's powerful. It's written by a woman. It shows empathy, and it's looking ahead because it's discussing industrialization, which will be, you know, a very big topic in literature for another 100 years. It still is somehow. And so I think that's really a text by an American woman that is worth reading. It's fantastic. Okay, now my next name, and I'm dropping names here, is of course Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's the most important person. And again, here you see that Christian influence. She's the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, which is the ultimate bestseller and classic that initiated women's writing in many ways. But okay, I think I have to jump some of these things. But basically, she started, you know, this idea that women can write, and she certainly had a big influence. And she published after the Civil War. Still, she also had a sister, by the way, Catherine Beecher, who was an anti-suffragist, quite interesting, who wrote about domestic economy, calisthenics, just crazy stuff. You know, the women's home, you know, the woman belongs into the home. She has to cook. And then, as you see, you know, towards the second half of the 19th century, she opposes women's suffrage. So the Beecher family is also very important. As you know, Harriet Beecher and Catherine Beecher also had a brother who was, oh God, what's his name again? William something Beecher. He was the most famous preacher in the United States of his time. His sermons were extremely famous, and he lived in and preached in Brooklyn. Anyway, here is a story about a housekeeper. She published in 1972, so she published lots of little stories for the rest of her life. And as you can see here, it's always a little bit backward looking at old tradition. And basically, she talks about the deacon, careful, and about the parson whose wife died and who has, you know, a young woman who does the household. And ultimately, then there's a lot of talk about this beautiful woman who does the household. And then finally, she marries him. Okay, but ultimately, she's cracking quite a few jokes at this doctor of divinity at Cambridge College, which is Harvard University, who is basically totally impractical and who needs a woman who helps him. For example, he doesn't understand how the turkeys are breeding their eggs and things like that. Okay, so ultimately, I'm not going through this because it's not all that good. But basically, there's a lot of gossip about this woman, and ultimately, at one point, they get married, and so all the people in the village are, of course, extremely excited, and there's a lot of gossip about it. And the parson ultimately says, "I will give him something worth talking about." By the way, notice also that there's a lot of spoken language here. You know, the whole realistic so-called vernacular is extremely important. And Harriet Beecher Stowe clearly is one of the people who have contributed to this. Okay, now let me start in the South. Chopin. I'm basically just listing all of these women because they're fairly important. Desiree's Baby is one of her most classic short stories, very important, published at the end of the century. Chopin is from New Orleans, so she basically offers perspectives from the American South. And Desiree has a baby. Desiree was adopted, as we can see here, so nobody knows where she came from, but she's extremely beautiful, and they say she was left by a party of Texans, whatever that means, okay? So there is this, notice the French name because we're talking about New Orleans, Armand Aubigny, who falls in love with her immediately, and he doesn't want to know where she's from because love can overcome racism, obviously, okay? This is the kind of naive attitude, but Kate Chopin is a little bit smarter, and this is why the story basically picks up that problem, because Desiree now has a baby, and as you can see, the house looks a little bit strange, even though she's happy. The house looks a little bit like the house of the Fall of Usher type of, you know, has become alive, personified, but Desiree basically is happy with her baby, and looks at the baby's fingernails that are cut by the black slave woman. I hope you realize that there was a kind of myth, you know, that you could tell a person's race by their fingernails at that time. So this is clearly a reference to this, that maybe somebody is going to find out that this little baby is not pure white. And so we have this scene where, you know, Desiree's mother is looking at the baby, and then she looks at the black slave. And somehow that implies that the color is being compared. Armand is described with a dark, handsome face. This is very interesting. Why is he described as darkness? At the moment, we get away with it because men are usually considered to be darker skinned than the beautiful light women in the cliche representation of men and women. So basically, one of the problems is that when the baby turns older, people start seeing that the baby is maybe a little bit too dark. Desiree realizes that the child is too dark, and it looks like one of La Blanche's little quadroon boys. You know, you have to realize in those days, there was a lot of racial mixing. Beautiful female slaves were raped by their owners, and the babies were of mixed race and became slaves. So anyway, we realize that her hand, Desiree's hand, is whiter than her husband's, but basically he objects. Your hand is as white as La Blanche's because La Blanche is a quadroon girl. Okay, and as you know, quadroons are 1/4 black only, and sometimes you have octoroons, you know, like her boys, which are 1/8 black only, which basically means genetically they can look perfectly white. You know, these people are, and race comes in here, legally black, but they look white. So anyway, what happens then is that Desiree is sent back to her mother with the baby. Her husband sends her away. She walks through the field. She's vulnerable. That is absolutely terrible. And I'm going pretty fast through this story because I don't think it's a brilliant story, but it's an important one. Anyway, at the plantation, the husband then makes a bonfire and he burns everything that belonged to his wife because he's totally shocked that obviously his wife was not pure white, he had found out. But then when he's in a frenzy of burning everything, he finds a bundle of letters, and one of the old letters is from the husband's own mother to his father, where she says that fortunately, their son, that is himself, does not know that his mother, who adored him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the burr. What is the burr? Sorry, I can't read everything. The brand, something of slavery. Anyway, so basically we find out that among the two, the one who is responsible for the black element in the baby is actually the father, because Armand, the father's mother, is the one who was part black. So basically, he finds out that he is the person responsible. The story basically discusses, you know, this whole issue of race, mixing of racism, of identity, and basically deconstructs this, we can say, in many ways. It shows that, of course, these accusations, in most cases, not only are stupid and false, but they're simply not true. We have an inversion of guilt. We have race that is arbitrary. So this is a nice story, but it's a little bit didactic, okay? But it's a classic of the New Orleans stories. I believe a much better story by Kate Chopin, and this is fantastic. This is called The Story of an Hour. It's very short, and you have to read it. It's about a lady called Mrs. Mallard who has heart trouble. You know, she has a weak heart. Anyway, she hears that her husband died in a railroad accident. There was a railroad accident, and we have the focalization of the caring relatives who watch her as she cries and retires to her room, and they all worry about her heart. You know, is she going to take it? Is she going to be able to, you know, survive this catastrophe that her beloved husband died? And so what happens is that the woman now is inside the room, focalizer changes. She looks out of the window where it's raining, which reminds you of an open window, freedom, rain means cleansing. And we read, she was young with a fair, calm face, whose line bespoke repression and even a certain strength. That's an interesting characterization. But we realize now that she's very emotional, and some feeling is breaking out, and you still expect that it's probably going to be mourning, sadness about the loss of her husband. But what is happening is that this thing is taking control over her. So the vacant stare and the look of terror suddenly give way to a monstrous joy that held her. You suddenly realize the news, the information that she's now a widow makes her happy, because obviously she was not happy as a wife. She realizes there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe that, whoops, they have the right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So we notice, in a sense, that she's reflecting on the yoke of marriage, and she will now be free. So the result of her husband's death is exactly the opposite of what people expected. Free, body and soul, free. She kept whispering. Wonderful, you know, also the echo of freedom, you know, which is this ultimate American concept. And outside, the relatives worry, you know, they bang on the door, you know, and want to know how she's doing, but she's basically, you know, getting drunk on that sense of freedom and thinking about all days, all sorts of days that would be her own. This is actually absolutely amazing. You know, she says, I'm free, the days will be my own. And I hope you realize that this is an echo or basically anticipating, because Virginia Woolf writes much later, when she has this whole essay about a room of one's own, that a woman needs her own space in order to be free. And basically this is extremely famous among feminists, as you all know. But basically in Chopin's short story, we have all of this anticipated. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes. She's so happy. She won, she made it. But then they hear a key, the latch key, and I hope you realize that the key stands always for the phallus. That's the male kind of thing. The men have the key. And then the husband comes back. He's a little bit dirty and he wonders what's happening, And we realize that he took a different train. He was not on that train. He didn't die. He's coming home, okay? But they basically try to negotiate this with his wife, but it's too late. When the doctors come, the wife has died. The wife had a heart condition. And you realize again, the heart condition is a physical weakness, but it's also a weakness in the relationship when it comes to love. And so basically, she died. She had a heart attack and she died at the end. And when the people interpret this, the doctors, they say it's the joy that kills. She must have been so happy that her husband survived that she had a heart attack. Now we know now, because we had the insight vocalization, that there's a lot of irony in this, that the medical diagnosis is wrong. And there is this subconscious thing, that made her happy. Anyway, I think that is an extremely powerful story. I'm basically just sharing with you some of the stories that I think are hot stuff, are just very, very important. I'm just mentioning this and I'm going pretty fast through it because it's too long. The Awakening is the story that made Kate Chopin really famous. It's a short novel about Edna Pontellier, who basically has all kinds of love relationships. She's in love with a guy, and then he leaves, and then ultimately she has a girlfriend. The man he loves cannot marry her. And so there are all kinds of issues. At one point, the man who would possibly, who she's in love with, leaves. And so Edna returns and at the end drowns herself in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a very New Orleans type of story. And feminists have been interpreting away, forever at this act of control where the woman basically disappears in the fluidity and experiences freedom, which is at the same time death, but seems to be better than living under the yoke of a man or being connected in a marriage that is not happy. So anyway, I hope you see that there are these powerful feminist issues being discussed by some of these women. And nowadays, as you know, there's a lot of English professors who are dyed-in-the-wool feminists, and that's basically the kind of literature that they live on. It's very, very important. Now, here is a very pretty lady that I want to introduce to you. She's one of my favorite. She's called Mary Wilkins Freeman. And I think she lived for a long time and she wrote for a long time. And she has a couple of absolutely gorgeous short stories that are extremely funny, but at the same time also deep and very, very important. And a New England Nun and Other Stories is her collection, her most famous collection, written in the 1890s. And it's basically about women who are in conflict with restrictive traditions, or who very often find new communities or gender roles that they feel happy with. And again, I'm not, one of these women specialists. This is just a part of the stuff that I read and teach, but I have to let you know that I am truly impressed by some of these texts. And if you ever want to write a good paper or do research, I can highly recommend some of these authors who are today fairly neglected, like Freeman, who is fabulous. The Revolt of Mother is absolutely wonderful. I'm going through it fairly quickly. It's basically about a barn, and it's about the father who is basically building a new barn. And the mother is totally unhappy about this because she says, we don't need a new barn. You promised us that we're going to have a new house. And the son, Sämi, says, father is going to buy more cows. This is interesting. This is basically the business acumen of New England. Remember, these Puritans and Quakers, they were business people. They were basically making money all the time. And you realize here that the mother does not even have a nice living room for herself, because all the living space is being used for productivity. So when she washes dishes with her daughter, she says, I wish we had a parlor. They would love to have a parlor. Okay. And she says, I was married in my mother's parlor with a carpet on the floor and stuffed furniture and a mahogany card table. That's what you want to have. You want to have a decent life. You want to have something nice. You also want to profit a little bit from all of that business that your husband is organizing. Okay. So anyway, she pleads her cause like a Webster. That's a reference to the infamous Daniel Webster, whom you may know from Mark Twain's Jumping Frog story. Anyway, so she basically would like to have a home, a parlor in a nice building, and not just have more cows. That's important. And she tells Nanny, is the daughter, we might have the wedding in the new barn. So maybe they're going to, they're building the new barn, but maybe they're going to turn it around. So then there's a situation where the father has to go and buy a horse, and he leaves in a Sunday suit to get the house. And Mrs. Penn, by the way, I hope you realize Penn, the name, has to do with Pennsylvania. That's a very common name, and it echoes, of course, again, the Quakers, who are the kind of people who lived in that area at that time. Okay, so what happens is actually that she moves the whole household into the brand new building and basically turns the brand new building into the new house where she can live. And so she invites the minister when he's visiting, please sit down. Wonderful. Here, more pictures. This is Mark Twain, as you can see, and a beautiful author. So anyway, what happens then is that she cooks for her husband. Look again at these wonderful names that these people have. And when he returns, of course, with the new horse, he's surprised. Why, mother? Also interesting that the couple, they call each other father and mother. This is all about very established family structures. But then he's weeping, and she has triumphed. She has used her female cunning and her power to get her parlor. But then he says, why, mother? He repeats this. I hadn't no idea you was so set on as all this comes to. He wasn't aware of her dreams and wishes. Women also have their desires, and they have been neglected. And these women authors are telling us about them. This is fantastic stuff. Okay, so, you know, lots of interesting topics that we can discuss. The church mouse is the best. It's just amazing. You know, it's basically about a woman who wants to become sexton in the church, but basically Caleb Gale, who is the deacon, says Hetty Fifield cannot be the sexton because I never heard of a woman being sexton. So he is basically a deacon of the church, but he's working out in the hayfield. Again, you know, we have these Protestants who are hardworking, materialists. It's important. And basically, we have this woman, Hetty, who would like to, you know, keep the place warm and ring the bell and take care of the church because she needs a job. But the question is then also, where can Hetty live? So we wonder what's happening here. We finally, we will at one point get the background. Anyway, Hetty has pretty black eyes, but she's an elderly woman. And I hope you realize that she defends herself. You know, she raised herself upon her toes. Wind caught her dress and made it blow out. Her eyes flashed. I hope you realize the small black eyes are the eyes of a mouse. She's called a church mouse. But this is an animal who is making herself big, who is trying to defend herself. And then she says, and that's in italics, I'm going to live in the meeting house. Whoa! What does that mean? Of course, you know that meeting house is the church. Remember, Quakers and sometimes also Puritans did not call the church a church because the church was a bad institution, the so-called high church, but they were talking about the meeting house. Very important. So she basically says, all she wants is a corner in the back gallery of the building, you know, to do a little bit of cooking and to sleep. And Caleb, who is, you know, the deacon responsible for the church, you know, tries to ignore her, and he doesn't really know what to do about this proposal. Now, we learn a little bit of background. Hetty actually is blackmailing him because Hetty had to move out of her old home, and there is no poorhouse in the town, and Hetty has no family, so you cannot simply send her somewhere. So where is she going to stay? And the people in the town have to take care of Hetty. Very important. And so ultimately she manipulates him, and he decides that she can stay in the church because she's being kicked out of her house. She needs a place to stay. With her small, eager face, she moves forward like an animal to the large cottage house. That's where she used to live, but in front of the cottage house, there's a little knot of household goods. Basically, like you say, a knot of wood, firewood imagery. So this is worthless. This is basically her belongings. It's not a lot. She used to live in this house, but now she has been kicked out. There's a woman in the door, small, haggard, fatigue, she's tired. This also tells you about the working days of the people there. They have to work very hard. And the woman looks at Hetty, and she has a family, lots of kids, and she says, we have no room for you. Her mother-in-law is going to arrive, which implies, you know, another element of oppression that women have to serve under. So anyway, Hetty then goes to the neighboring hut where there's a little boy, a young boy called Sämi. This is very funny. And she wants him to help carry her things to the meeting house, to the church. But Sämi is, of course, male and he's lazy. And his mother says he ain't able to lift much, which basically means he's weak. And Hetty, who is very rhetorical, she's wonderful. She says, I suppose he's able to be lifted, ain't he? To be lifted basically means, you know, in the religious sense, you know, that you can be spiritually improved, which of course, you know, sounds extremely sarcastic in this context. So anyway, Hetty then has a new place. She can stay in the church for 3 months, but then there is a big conflict. Anyway, she starts ringing the bell in a wild, irregular jangle. So I hope you realize the woman is making noise. And she's making noise in the church, which creates all kinds of disorder in the church. It's absolutely beautiful. And then she starts beautifying the church. You know, she's using sunflower quilts to make things beautiful. She has her own place, but then she says, you know, I have to sleep somewhere and I need to separate the room where I sleep from the rest of the church. And I need a stove to drink a cup of tea sometime. So we finally get the background. What happens is basically that she used to live with an old woman who died, who was her friend. And I hope you realize, you know, this implies that why did these women live together? Was it a lesbian affair? Was it what is called a Boston marriage? Freeman doesn't even have to talk about that. She just says, they lived together and that happened. And then when the old woman died, the property was taken away by the community because she had not paid her taxes. So they had to sell the property which belonged to that other woman in order to pay the taxes. And as a result, Hetty now was homeless and she had to move into the church. That's why it happened. So I want you to realize this is a wonderfully subtle accusation of the collective culture of greed in the village, you know. So anyway, you realize that these prosperous farmers are also fairly greedy and narrow-minded. There's, as I already said, no almshouse, and then no private family was willing to take her in because Hetty had a bad reputation in the village. There are stories about her sharp, sarcastic sayings. So she's not really the kind of lodger that you would like to have in her household. As you know, some of these old women become quite particular. Anyway, she likes handicrafts. She decorates the church. She puts a wax cross on the pulpit. She makes a wax virgin, you know, and there's so much beauty and decoration in the church that some of the Puritans even wondered if she savored popery, you know, this it's too Catholic, too much beauty. At one point, the problem really starts. That's 3 months after she moves in because she starts cooking and the church smells of turnips, you know, and this is a real problem. Something has to be done. They have to move her out because you don't want your church to smell like a kitchen. And so they want her to stay with Susan Radway, who is a good Christian woman, but whatever that means, you know, we realize that Hetty doesn't want to go there. She doesn't want to negotiate. She wants to stay in the church. And then the problem is that, you know, the deacons are basically, you know, these respected men in the religious community are negotiating with her. And we read these 3 steady, sober old men did not want to drag an old woman by the main force out of the meeting house. Caleb is lost and he's calling for mother. Mother is his wife, because obviously the man cannot handle this situation. It's a hilarious story, I think. And then when the men go out and they ask for the women to help, we read, they did not hear Hetty slip the bolt and turn the key. So she locks herself up in the church. And I hope you realize here that the lady is using the key and doing the locking up. Now they try to get back into the church and they try all kinds of keys, you know, big ones and small ones, but none of the keys work. They're stuck, you know. I want you to relish the whole phallic imagery, you know, where the men, you know, with their keys are basically making fools of themselves. Absolutely wonderful. Key after key was tried. Men brought all the large keys they could find. Freud would have loved that story. Okay. But then basically Hetty locks herself up. She had made her sacred castle impregnable except by violence. I mean, this is a fascinating, you know, female imagery, you know, that you have in these words. Okay. At this point, the women in the village start complaining and they say, you cannot treat a woman like that, you know. And there's a man who appears with a crowbar to open up the door. So they really want to use force, and, you know, with all this imagery. Of course, this is basically a kind of rape imagery that we are presented. And then Mrs. Gale tells her husband not to break down the door. Okay. And Hetty looks out of the window at them, and you realize, you know, this is just getting out of hand. The magnitude of her last act of defiance had caused it to react upon herself like an overloaded gun. She realizes that she's done something crazy, you know. And also look at the image of the overloaded gun, which is again absolutely beautiful. You know, you expect suddenly, you know, that the woman herself is connected to some kind of a phallic explosion. And I hope, as a footnote, that many of you know the poem My Life Has Been a Loaded Gun by Emily Dickinson. It's clearly a kind of imagery that we have to connect to the same type of tradition. Okay. Careful. So basically then, where are we? Here, she gives her speech, Hetty gives a speech, and then she's almost wailing at the end. And Mrs. Gale then becomes a more important character. She's in a sense like a queen, you know, so these male deacons of the church, you know, they have these women, these wives who are queen-like and more powerful. So basically, Mrs. Gale has a solution, and I think that's the real, you know, punchline of the story. She says, why couldn't she have that little room side of the pulpit where the minister hangs his hat? So they basically find out that there is actually space in the church where we could, you know, give her a room to live, and then she could work as a Saxon and have a job. And this whole idea of the room where the minister hangs his hat, there's a room that has no function at all except sort of supporting the authority, the hat of the minister. Okay, now please understand that I'm a Swiss, so we're into William Tell, and hats are very important symbolism for the Swiss. Anyway, so the church authority is challenged. There's a female solution, and the case is somehow settled. And 2 days later, we have Hetty's first happy Christmas because there's no one to molest or disturb her. This is interesting. So at that time, you have women who think being happy is being alone. Again, this is the Virginia Woolf topic of trying to get a room of one's own, and it happens long before Virginia Woolf. Okay, so anyway, so she's basically celebrating Christmas, and Christmas, is very important to her. Okay, we read Christmas had not been kept at all in this New England village when she was young. I hope you remember that the Puritans did not celebrate Christmas. Okay. So now basically she rings the bell and she awakes the whole village to Christmas Day. Somehow the new type of Christmas, as you know, towards the end of the 19th century, they invented Santa Claus, and Christmas became very popular, and you have these Charles Dickens stories about Christmas. So basically also in New England, there is a shift where Christmas is something else. And this sentimental Christmas empathy, is then basically presented in a very feminist way, and this is considered a real Christmas. Just a lovely story, and I'm so happy if I can share it with you. A New England's Nun is the third story I want to tell you about. It's basically the story that gave the title name to her collection, and it's about a woman called Louisa Ellis, who is alone. She's well organizing, she's sewing, and she's doing that female type of stuff. And we read, she folded precisely and laid in a basket, whatever the needle stuff, with her thimble and thread and scissors. So you realize this is a well-organized person, maybe a little bit stubborn. And she's preparing tea for herself. She doesn't want to have company. She is her own company. This is interesting, fancy stuff. And her only company seems to be the white dog called Caesar. So the only man companion is a big dog. Then she's visited by Joe Daggett, their small talk. Okay. He is her fiancé. This is a very complicated story. Joe Daggett basically doesn't live with her. He had to come home to take care of his mother, who is old, and his mother has a young girl called Lily Dyer, who is taking care of the old lady. And he says, I don't know how mother would get along without her. There's always these references to these capable women who are able to run a household. And he says, and Louisa says, yeah, she's capable and she's pretty good looking too. She's pretty looking, she's nice, okay? Joe Daggett then leaves and stumbles over the rug. He's a little bit like a bear, okay, in a china shop, and she cleans up after him. So we don't really know what this was all about, but again, we get background. We learn that basically they are going to marry in a month, but what happened is that there was a very long courtship because he had been away in Australia for 14 years to make his fortune, and they had only exchanged letters. However, they had gotten engaged, they had promised marriage to each other, and she had kissed him goodbye. And now his mother, however, was all alone, and he had returned. Anyway, we read that in these 14 years, when he had been in Australia, Louisa's feet had turned into a path, smooth maybe under a calm, serene sky, but so straight and unswerving that it could only meet a check at her grave, and so narrow that there was no room for anyone on her side. What does that mean? It basically means she has taken care of her own life. She has started certain habits, certain ways of living, and she doesn't really want to change or adapt herself to somebody else. And it will also be difficult for somebody else, like her poor fiancé, to live with her at some time. We read 15 years ago, she had been in love with him. At least she considered herself to be. Okay. But the problem is, of course, that in a sense, they both promised marriage to each other, and they both have to fulfill their promise. But Louisa doesn't really want to get married. Okay. Louisa, also doesn't want to move in with Joe's mother. Okay. We read again about the dog. Okay, who is supposed to be very nice. Anyway, that's not terribly important. What happens is basically she's able to communicate to Joe how she loves her dog and that she's fairly happy alone in her apartment, and they part tenderly. There's a kind of an understanding between them, even though she weeps a little. We read, the next morning on waking, she felt like a queen who, after fearing her domain be wrested away from her, seems firmly insured in her possession. Again, materialism is always important in New England. But what is interesting is that she can be a queen, a ruler, a dominant person, and she's been afraid that her home will be taken away from her. Okay, so basically she continues again her needlework, and she looks at the future days like pearls in a rosary. She loves a well-ordered single life. She basically is a person like an uncloistered nun. That's why we have this famous New England nun. And I realized that I have basically skipped some pages. I made a big problem, a big mistake, because that's not how the story ends. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that Louisa at one point goes for a walk, and then she sits down near a wall, and on the other side of the wall she hears Joe Daggett and Lily Dyer. And Lily Dyer says, I'm going to leave the town, and he says, I'm not saying anything. And we find out that Joe and Lily are in love, right? But there is a problem, because he will not, there is a problem because he says, I will not go back on a woman who has waited for me for 14 years and break her heart. He's loyal. He was engaged, and he's not going to leave, his fiancée. And Lily agrees. Lily basically says, yes, that's a good attitude. If you should jilt her tomorrow, I would not have you, right? She wants him to be a straightforward, honest man. Will she fret over it? And she says, I shan't fret over a married man. But she says, I'll never marry another man as long as I live. I ain't that sort of girl to feel this way twice. So we realize, we have a love triangle. We got this conflict. And so Louisa on the next day stops sewing on her wedding dress, because finally she and Joe came to an understanding. Okay. Joe says, I think maybe it's better that way, but if you wanted to keep on, I'd have stuck to you till my dying day. I hope you know that. So these two people are reliable, loyal, but Louisa has realized that, well, she doesn't want to get married. and Joe is in love with somebody else. So basically they break up that engagement, and now everybody is happy. Okay, and they part tenderly. There's actually a friendship in that separation. This is very, very important. And that's why, sorry, this is where I skipped the pages. She feels like a queen. She owns her own home and is extremely happy about this. And the rest of her life will be like the pearls in a rosary. You know, it's a well-ordered situation. That's why she's called a New England nun. Good. Rose Terry Cooke. I'm just going to skip this. I'm sorry. There's a lot of these names. She talks about Celia Barnes, who makes fun of old maids. She doesn't want to be an old maid. And then she marries a guy who is just awful. And the kind of men that the women can marry are all of these really bad, selfish kind of people, old farmers, young fellow, shiftless, etc. And so finally she marries a guy, and it's going to be really difficult. And ultimately she Deacon Everett's, and ultimately he dies, and she's very happy that she's alone again. This is much more important. It's not brilliant literature, but it ends like on the statement, "I'm so grateful to be an old maid again." It's basically, again, about this whole issue that you think the only aim for a woman in the 19th century is to get married to a man. And here we have this woman writer who says, no way, you know, this is something else. Okay, a big name again, Jewett, Sarah Orne Jewett. New England, lots of people came from New England at that time. She grew up in Maine on the seacoast, and she's a good friend of a woman called Annie Fields. Annie Fields was the wife of J.T. Fields, who was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly. So she had basically all the literary connections, and she got her article, her writing published in the Atlantic Monthly. Again, the Atlantic Monthly is extremely important. It's about 90% of, it's about 50%, half of late 19th century literature. It's so influential. She also wrote a novel called Deep Haven, another one about the country of the pointed firs, which is Maine, and then the most famous short story collection, and the very, very famous story called The White Heron, which is extremely famous. She joined the board of directors of the Audubon Society at one point. The Audubon Society, this is what people who do like birding, you know, they're bird watchers, and they save the birds. And so it's very important to save also the white heron. Again, I want to prepare you and tell you that, yes, this is very important. This is a typical type of story that feminists like. It starts with a little girl in the forest and her cow, and she's called Sylvia. You know, she's like a part of the forest. I mean, look at the name. And she gets along with the cow. There's a kind of empathy. You know, Sylvia is almost like nature. That's at least her name, you know, and her biggest friend is the cow, who likes to hide sometimes in that forest. The cow has a loud bell, but when the girl is looking for the cow is very smart, because sometimes it does not move. It just stands perfectly still, and then you cannot hear the bell. That's how you can hide. That is in itself an amazing image, very, very powerful, and it says a lot about what it means to be female and to protect yourself. You know, you have to hide. You don't want to be seen sometimes. If you don't want to participate, you know, in your standard rituals of gender interaction, for example. So anyway, the child is fairly alone. She lives with her grandmother called Miss Tilly, and is very happy in the shadows. Notice that basically, careful, the girl had grown up in a crowded manufacturing town. So you see here again, one of the topics that you have in all of these stories, and this is also typical of what is called local color or regionalism, is that you have the old traditional village structure opposed to industrialism. And industrialism also standardizes culture. Culture becomes loud, commercial, standardized. You know that from Stephen Crane. You know, you have the, what do you call that? Sorry. You know, the big department stores in the cities. That is a totally different culture. And so a lot of these women are basically hanging on to old traditions. Anyway, this is clearly a part of the characterization of Sylvia, who is somehow a part of nature. Then she's scared because there's a boy coming, a tall young man who is carrying a gun, who has lost his way, and who's very gallant. So he's in a sense like the prince from the fairy tale entering the scene, carrying a gun, of course. Okay, so Miss Tilly has a boarder now. She tells him about her life, you know, and you realize again also how women live, why they are alone sometimes, why they buried their children, why some of the children left. We get all of this background. But in the story, what is important is that this young man, this guest, is an ornithologist. He likes birds and he's looking for the white heron. And Sylvia knows that bird because she knows nature, but she doesn't really know how to react because the stranger wants to hunt the bird and stuff it. And so she's afraid that this is going to kill, you know, the beautiful bird and the nature. She's nervous, and we have this wonderful image where she keeps her gaze on a toad, and you realize this kind of implies the fairy tale of the frog prince, who is, however, a toad, and maybe the enchanted prince, the young man, is not really what she wants to have. She says she would like to have him better without his gun. She could not understand why he killed the very birds he seemed to like so much. And I hope you realize this is why this has become, you know, one of the founding stories of the Audubon Society, you know, of the American Society for the Protection of Wild Birds. This is very, very important. Okay. Anyway, you have all of your standard topics that have to do with these female stories. So she's basically dreaming of love, but it's complicated. Second part of the story, there's a big, big tree, a landmark. And when you are on top, you can see the sea, you can see everything. So there's an alternative kind of phallus, which is a part of nature. And when you see the sea, you can connect it to female fluidity. And what happens is that she climbs on that tree to find out where the white heron is. And the tree is described as a monstrous ladder reaching up almost the sky itself. So this is a kind of Jacob's ladder. I guess, it's a larger than life kind of experience. Very, very important. Something quasi-religious happening, and she's climbing up there. It was like a great main mast. So this is like taking her across the sea too. It means progress, the ship metaphor. And so basically she's up there on the tree. She's looking down at the village, and she's a gray-eyed child. I thought that was interesting. Basically seems to be a moment of maturation where maybe she gets adult, she grows up somehow. It's quite interesting. And then we have the narrator interfering, and she says, look, Sylvia, here's the white spot, here is the bird. Okay. And we're moving into the present tense. This is quite nicely done, how in a sense the narration, stops and makes an important point, So the epiphany, in a sense, that's the word I was looking for before, that she has on that gigantic tree, turns into a present tense. She knows the secret now. She knows the bird. And then at home, she sleeps. She would love to have the money because that stranger is offering money for the bird, but now she has to keep her silence. This is very, very important. She has to stay silent. She has to refuse the offer. And I hope you realize that this is like an echo of the situation of the cow that also has to keep quiet. You have to let nature survive. Again, I think that is also something interesting that I want to point out. This is a typical story which is about saving wildlife, and in a sense, human culture, human tradition in many of these stories is also be considered as something old, traditional, that you should not change, but that you somehow have to save in these beautiful stories about how the people used to live and about, the kind of experiences they had. Okay, so this is the problem. She basically, would like to have a fairy tale prince, but that doesn't work. She cannot tell the heron's secret and give his life away. Okay, so this is very complicated. Dear loyalty that suffered a sharp pang as the gun went away, disappointed later in the day, that could have served and followed him and loved him as a dog loves. I think it's dog here that I don't see on the screen. Anyway, she would have followed him, but it's not possible. It's simply not possible to be loyal to a man, to follow a man, to attach yourself to a man. That's not possible because he has a gun and he would destroy a certain type of nature, original order, etc. Anyway, the story is extremely famous, and there are lots of interpretations about it, and you can reread it a couple of times, and it's a great pleasure. And today, basically, my only idea is that I want to tell you about all of these important people. Anyway, okay, at the end, I see again, she hears a gun, and basically, but she stays herself alone, and she saved at least one of these birds. Very important. And I realized that my time is almost up, and I have not started talking about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is absolutely terrible. She's an interesting person. She's here speaking to a crowd. So she was a well-organized feminist. She divorced her husband. She had problems with hysteria, which was an issue at that time. She was nervous after giving birth, and she had to do one of these famous rest cures of Dr. Weir Mitchell. Weir Mitchell is this famous doctor who made the women lie down and just not move, which of course basically made them extremely passive and almost, you're not allowed to move. I mean, that is not healthy. So in order to cure them somehow, he made them really, really sick. Okay. Interesting is that she then at one point lives with her ex-husband's second wife and becomes the second mother of that child. So very interesting relationships. She marries a cousin. But one of the things that are interesting about her is that she's a famous feminist, and I'm very quickly going to mention the Yellow Wallpaper before you guys stop me because I've been talking way too long. But what is important about her is also that she believes in reform Darwinism, even though she's against male culture. In many ways, she was into eugenics. She thought that races could improve and could get better. So even though she's a feminist who believes in the right to vote for women, when she had cancer, for example, she committed suicide because she said, I have to control my life. I'm weak, I'm useless. So this is the eugenics kind of thing. And she actually promoted that people who are sick should be killed. This is something that is today extremely problematic, this whole eugenics kind of issue. She wrote a long novel called Her Land, which is interesting. It's a utopia about a society of women who basically just procreate without men. Very interesting. She wrote an interesting book called Women and Economics, with the subtitle, A Study of the Economic Relation Between Men and Women as a Factor in Social Evolution. Basically, starting, with a history of how the relations between men and women develop. I have to admit that I haven't read it yet, but, this is one of these books that are on my list, and I think it's probably very fascinating to figure out, how is she looking at this? And I hope you realize it's very realistic, it's very economic, fascinating. So since my time is up, I just mentioned to you the Yellow Wallpaper. You have to read that sometime. Notice that when you read this is so crazy. And it was published in the New England magazine. It's quite interesting. And it's absolutely amazing. And I am really sorry, I have no time to basically go through this. It's like a diary, and she's locked up there, but I have no time for it. And I have no time for Sui Sin Far, who is an Asian American author, which shows you that the women also bring in ethnic issues, who has a sister who basically paraded as a Japanese. So that's, the first 19th century Asian American issues, all kinds of interesting stories. And then the last person I don't have time to talk about is Gertrude Bonnin, also called Zitkala Sa, who is a Native American and who was also published, in the Atlantic Monthly, for example. As you can see, she had the classical education as a violin player, and started writing also about her experience and about Native American topics. So basically what you can learn from all of this is is the fact that there's a gigantic diversity and explosion of ideas in the late 19th century, and that the women play a big part of it. And so feminist issues are important, but even among the women, you have these ethnic issues that come up, and some of these ethnic authors are also women. So this is amazing. It's basically a cosmos that is opening up, and I'm halfway incompetent talking about it. It's just too much. Let's start reading. It's good stuff. Sorry, I'm done.
Sämi, thank you very much. I think I have a solution to the problem.
Okay.
If we really manage to get this common curriculum running, why don't you offer a class on these women writers, and those of our students who've gotten hooked up on what you've been telling us can actually take that class and go through these stories, and the ones that you didn't. Focus particularly on the ones you couldn't squeeze in today. And then that's going to be something that benefits all. Yeah,
sure. No, there's absolutely, these are wonderful texts. And I have to say, it's very simple when I just paraphrase some of the stories that I like and tell you about them. But ultimately, this is part of my credo, that what is important is not me. What is important is not my interpretation of the story, but the primary aim is that the students are reading these texts. I'm basically pointing at them and I'm saying, this is much more important for you. You should read these texts. They are fantastic. And maybe today I gave you a bit of a dose of this attitude, that I just started marveling about these texts and saying how wonderful they are.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder whether I should be more exhilarated at the fact that these women already wrote about these topics and thematized issues that are still with us today, or whether I should be heartbroken over the fact that these issues are still with us today, and we don't seem to have made all that much progress within the last 150 years. But thank you very much, Sämi Ludwig, for your contribution today to Stephen Crane's Times. I also recommend Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, even though it's sort of at the far end of Crane's Times, 1915. And she certainly doesn't know a lot about biology, but it's one of the few feminist, utopias, and at the time when utopias were already on the wane. So this is a much more important text, I think, than it has been credited. Okay, thank you all for attending. There were actually people in the room besides myself and Sabina and Isabel. There were at least 2 students, and we had listeners online too.
I'm sorry that I talked so long. There's no time for real questions.
Yeah. Well, you can send in the questions. Everybody's writing logs anyway. I would forward those logs to you, Sämi.
Oh, that'd be
like
nice
I did
to have.
last time already with some of them anyway. And then maybe discussion can develop out of that if people want that.
Excellent.
Yeah, don't want to use up too much of your time. I mean, this is all extra what we're doing here, in excess of teaching loads in France and in Germany and in Switzerland.
Yeah. But it's fun.
But that's what sort of be working at the university is all about. Always a little bit in excess of sort of above and beyond the call of duty. Again,
exactly.
Sämi, thank you very much. I think we'll have to get you an honorary doctorate at this university at some point.
You don't have to. I have to thank you so much for inviting me. You're absolutely wonderful. Thank you. It's absolutely wonderful that I get this occasion and that I'm able to, just
anytime I'll call on you again.
Wonderful. We'll do that again forever.
Yep.
Take care.
You too.
Greetings to everybody.